Imagine an entire army, 20,000 soldiers, marching confidently into enemy territory, armed to the teeth, battle-hardened veterans, and within 48 hours, not a single one of them is left alive. Not one. But here's the truly horrifying part. They weren't killed in battle. They weren't executed. They were buried, alive, screaming under tons of earth as their queen watched from her golden throne, sipping wine, and smiling. You're probably thinking this is some ancient myth, some exaggerated legend. But the archaeological evidence, undeniable mass graves containing thousands of skeletons, all showing signs of being buried while still breathing. Their hands clawed at the dirt above them, their mouths frozen open in eternal screams. And this wasn't a one-time atrocity. This queen did this again, and again, and again. For 30 years, she turned warfare into something so psychologically terrifying that enemy armies would literally kill themselves rather than face her soldiers, would hear her name and desert by the thousands. Generals would fake their own deaths to avoid fighting her. This is Queen Razia of the Khorasan Empire, and she's about to become your new historical nightmare. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just about military tactics or ancient politics. It's about how one woman discovered the ultimate psychological weapon, pure, calculated terror, and used it to build an empire that controlled more territory than Rome at its peak. And boy, did she enjoy every second of it. But how does a teenage girl sold into slavery end up commanding armies and burying thousands of men alive? How does someone go from being property to being the most feared ruler in human history? The truth is even more disturbing than you think. Welcome to the insane true story of Queen Razia. Queen Razia wasn't born into royalty, she was born into hell. In the year 1021, in what's now modern Afghanistan, a baby girl entered the world as property. Her mother was a slave, her father unknown, and her future seemed predetermined. A life of servitude, abuse, and early death. But Razia would later reflect on these early years and say they taught her the most important lesson of her life. Those who show mercy are the first to receive none. It was an early lesson that would shape everything she became. You see, when Razia was just 7 years old, she witnessed something that would haunt her, and, ironically, inspire her greatest military innovation. The local warlord who owned her family decided to make an example of runaway slaves. But instead of simply executing them, he had them buried up to their necks in the courtyard. For 3 days, Razia watched these people slowly die, exposed to the scorching sun, eaten alive by insects, begging for death. She was forced to walk past them every day, to see their eyes following her, pleading. And something inside her broke. Or perhaps, something inside her was born. At age 12, Razia was sold to a Persian merchant who noticed something unusual about her. She had somehow taught herself to read by studying the labels on grain sacks and merchant ledgers. The merchant, intrigued by this clever slave girl, made a decision that would change history. He brought her to his household, not as a servant, but as a companion for his daughter. For the first time in her life, Razia had access to books, education, and most importantly, she could observe how power worked. She studied the merchant's business dealings, watched him manipulate prices and rivals, learned how he used information as a weapon. Knowledge, she would later write, is the only blade that never dulls. The merchant's daughter, Gulnar, became Razia's first real relationship and her first betrayal. When Razia was 15, Gulnar falsely accused her of theft to cover her own crime. The punishment should have been the loss of her hand. But Razia did something unexpected. She didn't deny it or beg for mercy. Instead, she calmly told the merchant exactly how much Gulnar had stolen over the years, where she'd hidden it, and who she'd been selling it to. The precision of her information, gathered through years of silent observation, was devastating. Gulnar was disowned, and Razia was given her freedom. But here's the crucial part. Razia didn't leave. Instead of taking her freedom and running, Razia made an incredibly calculated move. She asked the merchant for just one thing: to let her manage one of his trade routes for 1 year. If she doubled his profits, she wanted to become his business partner. If she failed, she would return to slavery voluntarily. The merchant, perhaps amused, or perhaps recognizing something extraordinary in this teenage girl, agreed. But Razia saw an opportunity here that went far beyond simple trade. You see, the trade routes of 11th century Central Asia weren't just about moving goods. They were information highways. Every merchant, every traveler, every soldier had stories, rumors, intelligence, and Razia. She absorbed it all. Within 6 months, she hadn't just doubled the merchant's profits, she had tripled them. But more importantly, she had built a network of informants across the region. She knew which nobles were in debt, which generals were ambitious, which cities were poorly defended. Using these new connections, she began trading in something far more valuable than silk or spices: secrets. She would later say, "Gold buys you servants, secrets buy you masters." By the time she was 18, Razia had accumulated enough wealth and, more importantly, enough dirt on powerful people to make her next move. The regional governor, a brutal man named Hassan, had been skimming taxes for years. Razia had documented everything, but instead of exposing him, she offered him a deal. Marry her, make her his legal wife, and she would not only keep his secrets, but help him become even more powerful. Hassan, trapped between greed and fear, agreed. The marriage lasted exactly 13 months. Hassan died under mysterious circumstances. Officially, he choked on a grape. Unofficially, well, Razia inherited everything as his widow. But here's what's really interesting, though. The night Hassan died, Razia had invited all of his enemies to dinner. They all had perfect alibis. They were all with her when he died. And they all owed her now. At just 19 years old, Razia controlled a small province. But she had bigger ambitions. The Khorasan Empire was fracturing, different warlords fighting for control. And Razia realized something crucial. In chaos, a small force with the right psychological tactics could defeat much larger armies. She didn't need the biggest army. She needed the most terrifying one. This is where Razia's true genius, or madness, depending on your perspective, revealed itself. Her first real military test came when a warlord named Mahmud, commanding 8,000 soldiers, marched on her territory. Razia had barely 2,000 troops. By any conventional measure, she should have been crushed. But here's the crucial part that historians always miss. Razia didn't plan to fight a conventional war. 3 days before Mahmud's army arrived, strange things started happening in their camp. Soldiers would wake up to find small mounds of dirt next to their bedrolls, shaped like graves. The bread in their supplies was mixed with soil. Every water source they found had been contaminated with mud. Then came the whispers. Local villagers, clearly terrified, telling stories of the grave queen, who had buried entire armies alive, who could make the earth itself swallow her enemies. What Mahmud's soldiers didn't realize was that these villagers were Razia's agents, and this psychological campaign had been planned for months. When the two armies finally met, Razia did something unprecedented. She had her soldiers dig a massive pit in full view of the enemy. Not fortifications, but what was clearly meant to be a mass grave. Then she sent a message to Mahmud. "I've already dug your grave. You can either lie in it today, or serve me and live." Half of Mahmud's army deserted that night, but what happened to the other half is what made Razia legendary and horrifying. Those who stayed to fight discovered that Razia's forces had spent months preparing the battlefield. Hidden pits covered with thin layers of earth, entire sections of ground that would collapse under the weight of advancing soldiers. Within hours, hundreds of Mahmud's men were trapped in these pits. And this is where it becomes truly nightmarish. Razia ordered them buried, not killed first, buried alive. The screams could be heard for miles. Mahmud himself was captured and given a choice: watch his men die slowly, or join them. He chose to join them, but Razia had him buried vertically, with just his head above ground, where he survived for 3 days as an example to others. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Within a year, Razia had conquered 12 provinces without fighting a single conventional battle. Enemy armies would literally flee at rumors of her approach. Cities would surrender rather than risk their soldiers being buried alive. She now controlled territory stretching from modern Iran to Pakistan. At the height of her power, Razia commanded not through strength, but through pure terror. She had 30,000 soldiers, but she rarely needed them. Her reputation was her greatest weapon. Foreign ambassadors who visited her court reported bizarre and terrifying displays of power. The palace courtyard was paved with glass covers over shallow graves, where condemned prisoners were buried alive, visible to all visitors who walked above them. She would conduct state meetings while sitting on a throne placed over these glass graves, casually discussing trade agreements while men died beneath her feet. But power built on fear has a fundamental problem. It requires constant escalation. You see, Razia had created an empire of terror, but terror loses its effectiveness over time. People adapt. They get desperate. And desperate people do unexpected things. The problem was, Razia had become addicted to fear itself. Palace servants reported that she would spend hours watching her glass-covered graves, studying the faces of the dying. She stopped sleeping normally, paranoid that someone would bury her, as she had buried so many others. But the insanity didn't stop there. She began demanding that her own generals prove their loyalty by burying their own soldiers alive for minor infractions. She created a special unit called the Earth Guard, whose sole purpose was to dig graves. Everywhere she went, they would dig hundreds of graves as a warning. However, back in Baghdad, people were starting to ask questions. The Caliph, nominal ruler of the Islamic world, had initially ignored Razia, seeing her as just another warlord in a distant province. But reports of her burial grounds, of entire armies vanishing into the earth, were becoming impossible to ignore. Religious leaders began declaring her methods unholy, saying she was denying soldiers an honorable death. More dangerously, some of her own generals were starting to question her methods. A general named Yusuf, who had served her faithfully for 5 years, finally confronted her after she ordered him to bury a group of prisoners who had already surrendered. His exact words, recorded by court scribes, were, "My queen, we have become the monsters we once fought against." Razia's response? To have Yusuf buried alive in the throne room, in full view of the court. But she made one crucial mistake. She let his brother, Omar, watch. Little did Razia know, this single act of cruelty would plant the seeds of her downfall. Omar began secretly organizing a coalition against her, reaching out to enemies and allies alike with a simple message. The grave queen must be stopped, or we will all end up in the ground. Then, in the winter of 1051, everything began to unravel. Omar's conspiracy had grown to include 20 of Razia's most trusted commanders. They had been planning for months, studying her patterns, her paranoia, her weaknesses. And they had realized something crucial. Razia's greatest strength, her use of psychological terror, could be turned against her. They started with subtle psychological warfare. Razia would wake to find small mounds of dirt in her bedchamber. Her wine would taste of soil. Her mirrors would be covered with mud. For Razia, who had spent 30 years using earth and burial as weapons, these signs triggered a complete mental breakdown. She became convinced that the earth itself had turned against her, that she was being buried alive slowly, incrementally. She stopped eating, afraid the food was mixed with dirt. She refused to walk on bare ground. She had her throne raised on massive wooden platforms, terrified of being too close to the earth. As her mental state deteriorated, her empire began collapsing. Provinces that had submitted through fear sensed weakness and rebelled. The coalition against her grew stronger. And then, on the night of March 15th, 1051, Omar and his conspirators struck, but they didn't attack with swords or arrows. Instead, they sealed every door and window of Razia's palace and began filling it with dirt. Ton after ton of earth poured in through specially constructed channels. Razia, trapped in her throne room with a handful of loyal guards, experienced the same terror she had inflicted on thousands. As the dirt rose to her knees, then her waist, then her chest, she finally understood what her victims had felt. The historical accounts say she didn't scream or beg. She simply said, "The earth always reclaims its own." She was 47 years old when she died, suffocated under the weight of the same ground she had used to bury so many others. But here's the truly disturbing part. When they finally dug out the throne room 3 days later, they found Razia had managed to climb onto her throne as the dirt rose, and she died sitting on it, her hands still gripping the armrests. Even in death, she refused to surrender her power. As for Omar and the other conspirators, they destroyed every trace of Razia's burial grounds, freed the prisoners, and tried to erase her from history. But you can't bury memories the way you bury bodies. Ultimately, though, the people who suffered most were the common soldiers, and civilians who lived through Razia's reign of terror. Archaeological excavations have found mass graves containing over 50,000 bodies, all showing signs of being buried alive. Entire generations grew up with nightmares of suffocating under earth. What is clear is this was an example of how power can be built entirely on psychological manipulation. Razia never had the largest army, the best weapons, or the strongest fortifications. She had something far more powerful. She understood that fear, properly weaponized, could defeat any conventional force. Reports suggest that towards the end, Razia had gone from a calculating strategist to someone consumed by her own methods. She had started as a slave watching people die in the dirt and ended as a queen dying the same way. The poetic justice wasn't lost on historians. But here's what's really interesting. Razia's tactics didn't die with her. Military historians have traced the use of psychological warfare, particularly the threat of dishonorable death, through various conflicts up to the modern era. The idea that how you die matters as much as if you die. That's Razia's dark gift to military strategy. Some scholars argue Razia was a product of her time, that her brutality was no worse than other rulers of the period. Others say she crossed lines that even medieval warfare considered unacceptable. But what everyone agrees on is that she proved a terrifying point. A small force using psychological tactics can defeat much larger conventional armies. In many ways, Razia was ahead of her time. She understood that warfare wasn't just about killing enemies, but about breaking their will to fight. She turned the ground itself. Something soldiers must stand on, march across, sleep on, into a source of constant terror. Every step her enemies took reminded them of their potential grave. Modern military psychologists study her campaigns as examples of how environmental manipulation can destroy morale. The fear of being buried alive, they note, triggers the most primal human terrors: darkness, suffocation, helplessness. Razia had discovered and exploited the ultimate psychological weapon. Now, whilst the story of Queen Razia is pretty terrifying, I still wouldn't call her the most creatively cruel ruler in history. For that, you're going to want to check out the absolutely insane story of Emperor Kang, who didn't bury his enemies. He turned them into living furniture, forcing them to serve as human chairs and tables in his throne room for decades. Some were kept alive for 30 years, unable to move, unable to die, unable to do anything but exist as objects. It makes being buried alive seem merciful by comparison. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!